Ladies and gentlemen, we are back with Tap Into the Truth, and we are talking about the threats that our government faces from within. Our topic we still haven't even really gotten to directly just yet, and that is the possibility of a third and who knows how many possible terms for the man who would be emperor, the man who thinks he's already king, the occupier of the White House, Barack Hussein Obama. We are right now talking about the 14th Amendment and how certain members of the Democratic Party seem to think that that would give the executive branch the authority to completely ignore Congress and Congress's responsibility in dealing with debt. The point of fact, the 14th Amendment only says that Congress doesn't have the legal authority to ignore public debt. And even as far as that goes, it was expressly intended to define the public debt of the federal government of the United States as being separate from the public debt of the Confederate States of America, which at that time no longer exists and was being forced back into the Union at the end of the Civil War. Much of the 14th Amendment has very little to do with Congress and cash. It has more to do with the definitions of citizenship, establishment of due process, and with equal protection under the law. That's what the amendment was for. It doesn't say the president at any point in time. It says Congress may not ignore the public debt. If Congress runs up a debt, it's got to pay it. What that means is at some point in time, what the 14th Amendment really does, if you're going to focus on that part, is that Congress needs to take steps in order to pay the debt. Some people say that that actually means that a debt ceiling is unconstitutional. Well, how about this? I've read it a few times. I've looked over it. You can find it online. Anybody interested, go ahead and Google it. You can find it on Wikipedia. You can find it on literally hundreds of websites with its word for word right there. Feel free to read it. It'll take you a while to get to the part that's in question here, because again, it starts with the issue of citizenship. Because at that point in time, many southern states, in particularly the former Confederate states, were refusing to acknowledge that any children of slaves legally had the right to be citizens. Considering that this was also passed at a point in time where there were no restrictions on immigration, there was no such thing as an illegal immigrant. So, by that same token, there was no concern about the ever so popular anchor baby phenomenon that has become a mainstay for several folks looking for a better life. Come here, have a kid. Well, the kid's automatically a citizen now, thanks to the 14th Amendment. That's been part of the argument for trying to amend the 14th Amendment itself and trying to reestablish under the new guidelines, since there are restrictions on immigration now, a more reasonable definition for citizenship. I mean, I'm not necessarily saying that I like the idea of going in and changing any amendments or doing away with any of the amendments currently, but I can see where there could be a legitimate argument made that if you're not a legal resident of this nation, then your child being born here, especially if you have no intent of becoming a legal resident here, should not automatically be given citizenship. You can make that argument. I'm not saying I'm pro or against. I am saying that there is a discussion to be had there, and I think that when you take into consideration the literal plethora of benefits that suddenly these parents have of these newly minted citizens, they literally can bring over dozens of other relatives on half a dozen legal grounds that are currently permitted. The anchor baby phenomenon would immediately be ended with just a slight amendment towards the definition of what constitutes legal citizenship here. Now, the only way to do that would be to amend the 14th Amendment. But that's a much bigger deal and a much bigger part of it. And quite honestly, the most important part of the 14th Amendment is due process. I wouldn't want anybody getting in there and tweaking and messing around too much with the one amendment that guarantees us the right to due process and to equal protection. But when you stop and think about it, isn't the National Defense Authorization Act fly in the face of the 14th Amendment? Aren't they already ignoring the 14th Amendment on that grounds? Because let's not forget that as they say when they talk about it, it theoretically gives the military the right to indefinitely detain American citizens just because of the perception that they might somehow be involved with terrorism. The real terrorism is being conducted from the people who are passing these kind of laws and allowing them to get to the president's desk in the first place. I mean, this would not be a safe law for the citizenry of this nation if the most conservative president ever was sitting at that desk, let alone someone who has not been duly elected, who is indeed an occupier, who is indeed a Marxist socialist, who has a bitter hatred of capitalism ingrained in him from a small child, and who has publicly stated and is quoted even in his books that he will stand with the Muslims if the political air turns nasty. There's nothing wrong with siding with any particular group that you feel a kindred spirit to. But you must recognize that he does indeed feel that kindred spirit and would be willing to put the needs of that group ahead of the needs of other groups. He's already demonstrated the fact that he indeed does favor Muslim organizations, terrorist organizations, over that of Israel. He's done it several times. The question becomes, to what end? And exactly which Muslims are he talking about? Because not all Muslims are the problem, are they? Ladies and gentlemen, there are plenty of people who follow the faith of Islam, who believe in the Prophet Muhammad, and who believe in his teachings. Most Christians would probably be surprised to learn that in the Quran it talks about the virgin birth of Jesus to the Virgin Mary. There are several points where Christianity and the Muslim faith actually coincide. A unpopular fact of Islam is the fact that the Prophet Muhammad was born a Jew and was turned away by the Jewish leadership at the time, the folks who ran the temple, because they didn't believe him to be a prophet. And Muhammad took that personally, and suddenly Islam was born. Over time, that's the reason why there's so much anger by the more extremist branches of Islam directed towards the Jewish people. When a man comes out and publicly says he will side with that group over the other, and then gets to the position of authority that he's in now, and continues to show through the power of the bully pulpit and through the power of economic assistance and aid, that he does indeed side with the others, despite the fact that Israel has been one of the strongest allies the United States has ever had, then the question should be, how far can you trust this gentleman when it comes to passing laws that require detainees at Gitmo to stay X amount of time. He doesn't like that aspect of it, but has no problems with the aspect of the law that would allow indefinite detainment of American citizens. Could it be because he sees Tea Party members as a threat? Speaking of Tea Party, there has been quite the to-do in regards to the Kansas House delegation as they voted unanimously against the Hurricane Sandy relief bill. Most of the people who observed this said that it's because they were afraid the Tea Party were going to run candidates against them in the primaries. Well, I don't believe that to be the case. The original smaller bill that got voted on and passed, despite Kansas being against it in its entirety, is directed specifically towards the flood insurance. Now, the real crux to the argument there comes from the fact that should the federal government be involved with this type of charity, or should this be left to the people? There are several, as conservatives in particular, folks that believe that the government has no business having a role in this. So they voted against it, following a core principle. I clearly can see the legitimacy of the argument, but in this particular case, it's obvious that the way certain people want to report this story and try to turn it into a story, that they, again, want to try and point fingers at the Tea Party for what was quoted as being a short-sighted vote. Well, it didn't make any difference since it passed anyway. And what's wrong with some conservatives standing up for their principle? Technically, isn't that what every single member of the House and the Senate are supposed to do? That's what Congress is. They are supposed to be representing us, and if they were voted and elected by a block of citizens that have a set of core values, they have got to follow through with that. The idea that the Tea Party possibly running candidates in primaries, given that elections are quite a ways off, seems a desperate attempt to point a finger somewhere where it just doesn't belong. It's because they don't want to talk about the fact that not only does this particular measure raise the question once again of how much money Congress should be sending in an emergency situation, that is emergency budgeting, not in any kind of budget, even including the baselines that they've been running on a continuing resolution basis, since we don't actually have a budget. But it also still raises the question even further of the larger spending bill being an issue. I mean, the Kansas folks themselves said that the reason they voted no was because they didn't see anything in this to offset the extra spending. That sounds legit to me. This is the first part of the show. We will be right back in just a few moments with part 2 of Obama's third term.